The Arctic wind screamed through the barren expanse, whipping up a white haze that blurred the lines between the land and sky. The tundra stretched endlessly in every direction, an unforgiving wasteland where only the strongest survived. And today, survival was slipping away from one of its own. The reindeer's legs trembled violently as it stumbled forward, dragging itself through the snow. Each step was a battle, every breath labored and weak. Pain had become its constant companion. It had tried to keep up with the herd, tried to ignore the gnawing agony in its limbs, the weight that had settled unnaturally on its body. But the others had sensed its weakness. They had moved on, vanishing into the storm, leaving it behind. And now it was alone. The barnacles had spread too far. At first, they had been nothing more than small, hardened lumps, clinging to the reindeer's legs and belly. But as the days passed, they grew, festering, multiplying, digging deeper into its flesh. The parasites nestled inside them had begun eating away at the muscle, leaving open sores, raw and oozing. The reindeer collapsed onto the frozen ground, gasping. The wind howled around it, but it was no longer aware of the cold. The pain was all-consuming. Its dark, glassy eyes scanned the horizon, searching for the herd, for shelter, for something. But there was nothing. The parasites wriggled inside its wounds, burrowing deeper. This was the end. It would not last the night. Eric adjusted his visor as his snowmobile tore across the icy terrain, kicking up a blizzard of powder behind him. His hands, despite being protected by thick gloves, were numb from the cold. The wind cut through his insulated jacket, sending chills down his spine. Something was wrong this season. They had been tracking the reindeer migration patterns for weeks, but something was off. More stragglers, more reports of sick and injured animals, more radio calls from local hunters, describing creatures that didn't look quite right. And then the call came in. "We've got an injured one. It's bad." Ayla's voice crackled through the radio, barely cutting through the static. Eric's stomach tightened. It was always bad. They had seen too many of these cases lately, but something in Ayla's tone made his pulse quicken. "How bad?" he asked, gripping the throttle. A pause, then, "You need to see it for yourself." They found it half buried in the snow, curled into itself, barely breathing. The first thing Eric noticed was the smell. Even in the freezing temperatures, the stench of rot clung to the air. Then, the parasites. The reindeer's once thick, majestic fur was riddled with grotesque, hardened growths. Clusters of barnacles, fused into its flesh, burrowed deep into the wounds they had carved. The once strong creature was being eaten alive. Eric had never seen anything like it. Barnacles didn't belong on land animals. They were creatures of the ocean, of salt water and tides, of whales and shipwrecks. Not here, not in the Arctic. Yet here they were, embedded into the reindeer's body, like tumors, like something out of a nightmare. Ayla crouched beside it, eyes wide with disbelief. "How the hell did this happen?" she murmured, reaching out with hesitant fingers, stopping just short of touching the reindeer's trembling body. It let out a weak, wheezing breath. It was still alive, but not for long. If they didn't act now, it wouldn't survive the night. Eric took a slow breath and reached for the tranquilizer gun. This wasn't just a rescue mission. It was a race against something they didn't understand, and time was already running out. Eric knelt beside the reindeer, his breath visible in the freezing air as he studied its condition. It was worse than he thought. The barnacles had spread across its body, warping its flesh, tunneling deep into the muscle. Some had cracked open, revealing festering wounds beneath. The parasites inside wriggled like maggots in a corpse, burrowing deeper with every passing second. The reindeer twitched weakly, its dark eyes glassy with pain. It was dying in slow agony. Eric clenched his jaw and lifted the tranquilizer gun. "We can't move it in this condition," Ayla said, voice tight. "It'll go into shock." Eric nodded, adjusting the dosage. One clean shot, enough to ease the pain but not stop its heart. The dart hissed as it struck the reindeer's flank. The animal let out a weak, pained grunt, its muscles tensing. Then slowly, its breathing grew steadier. Not gone, just under. Ayla pressed a hand to its flank, feeling the slow, faint rise and fall of its chest. It was still with them. The storm was closing in fast. The wind had picked up, screaming through the tundra, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Snow swirled in thick, suffocating waves, already starting to bury their gear. Eric turned to the rest of the team. "We need to move now." Loading the reindeer onto the transport sled was a battle of its own. Even sedated, it was heavy, its massive frame refusing to cooperate as they struggled against the terrain. Their boots slipped on ice, hands numb despite the thick gloves. Ayla nearly lost her grip, almost falling backwards into the snow. Then, movement in the distance. Eric turned sharply, his pulse spiking. Through the wall of snow, two dark shapes loomed in the distance. Watching, waiting, wolves. Ayla saw them too. "Shit! Eric, we have to go!" Predators could smell weakness, and right now, this reindeer was nothing but a wounded meal. Eric cursed under his breath and gave one last push. The reindeer's body finally slid onto the sled. The wolves took a slow step forward, their eyes locked on the struggling humans. Eric grabbed his flare gun and fired. The flash of red light burned against the snowstorm, the wolves flinching back. But they didn't run. Not yet. They were waiting for a mistake. Ayla secured the reindeer with ropes as Eric jumped onto the snowmobile. "Hold on!" They took off. The tundra became a blur as the snowmobile sped through the frozen wasteland, the sled jerking behind them. Eric's knuckles turned white on the throttle. The storm raged around them, the cold cutting through their suits like knives. The wind howled, drowning out everything else. They weren't going to make it, not in time. The nearest research outpost was still miles away, and the reindeer was fading. Then the radio crackled to life. "Eric, this is base. Visibility's shot. You need to find shelter." Shelter. Eric scanned the landscape, his heart hammering. There was nothing but endless white. Then, a shadow in the distance. A ridge. A cave. He didn't think. He just turned the snowmobile hard, veering off the main path, heading straight for the rocky formation. Ayla braced herself as the sled jolted violently behind them. But she didn't argue. They had no other choice. The cave was narrow, dark, and barely deep enough to shield them from the storm. But it was enough. Eric and Ayla hauled the reindeer inside, their bodies screaming with exhaustion. The reindeer let out a weak, shuddering breath, its body trembling from the cold and blood loss. Ayla ripped off her gloves, pressing her bare hands against the reindeer's flank, feeling for warmth. "We need to get these parasites off. Now." There was no time to wait for backup. The only option was to cut them out. Here, now, in the dark. Eric pulled out his hunting knife. His hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from what they were about to do. The first incision was deep, and the reindeer screamed. The reindeer thrashed weakly beneath Eric's hands, its body convulsing with pain. The barnacles had fused deep into its flesh, their jagged shells embedded in swollen, infected wounds. Each incision Eric made sent fresh blood spilling onto the frozen ground, pooling in the ice beneath them. The stink of rot clung to the air, mixing with the biting cold. Ayla pressed down on the reindeer's flank, her bare fingers trembling. "It's going into shock," she murmured, her breath fogging against the frigid air. She reached for the med kit, hands slick with blood as she fumbled for the stabilizing drugs. "We're losing it, Eric. We have to be faster. Faster!" Eric gritted his teeth, gripping the knife tighter. He had trained for field extractions, had performed emergency procedures on wildlife before, but nothing like this. Nothing this grotesque. The barnacles weren't just attached to the reindeer, they had grown inside of it. Tiny writhing parasites crawled deeper into the exposed flesh, their pale, segmented bodies squirming in the open air. They disappeared into the muscle as soon as the barnacles were removed, digging deeper, escaping, hiding. Eric's stomach lurched. What the hell was this? This wasn't a normal infection. Ayla grabbed his wrist, eyes wide with alarm. "Do you see that?" The parasites weren't just burrowing. They were moving toward the reindeer's heart. Eric's breath hitched. If they reached the vital organs, it was over. The reindeer's body convulsed violently, legs kicking against the stone floor of the cave. It let out a weak, broken groan, the sound of an animal that knew it was dying. "No, no, no, stay with us," Ayla pleaded, pressing a syringe against its hide. The needle bent before it could pierce the skin. Eric's heart slammed against his ribs. The parasites had hardened the tissue, reinforced it like armor. This wasn't a disease. This was something else. Outside, The wind roared through the cave entrance, carrying the distant, eerie howls of wolves. The storm was closing in, sealing them inside. The reindeer was their only priority now, but the realization burned in Eric's gut. If these parasites had taken hold in this reindeer, how many more were already infected? And how long before it spread to something else? Ayla met his gaze, her face pale in the dim light. "We have to kill them all, Eric. Every last one." There was no more hesitation. Eric drove the blade deeper, cutting faster, ignoring the sickening squelch of flesh parting, the writhing things screeching as they were exposed to the open air. He and Ayla worked together, ripping out the barnacles, crushing the parasites beneath their boots. The reindeer's body convulsed one last time, and then it went still. Eric froze, the knife slipping from his bloodied fingers. "No!" Ayla pressed her ear to its chest, fingers shaking as she reached for a pulse. Seconds dragged on like hours. Then, a faint, weak heartbeat. Barely there, but still fighting. Eric exhaled sharply, pressing a hand against his forehead, relief crashing over him like a wave. The reindeer was alive. Barely, but alive. Ayla let out a shuddering breath. "We did it. For now." Eric glanced down at the pile of dead parasites at their feet, their twisted bodies curling inward as they shriveled in the cold. The barnacles lay shattered, oozing a black, tar-like substance that burned against the ice. Something was deeply wrong with this. This was more than an infection, more than a parasite. This was a warning. Outside, the wind howled, the sound almost human in its grief. And in the distance, another howl answered it. The wind had died down by the time Eric and Ayla emerged from the cave, dragging the sled behind them. The reindeer, still barely clinging to life, lay wrapped in thermal blankets, its shallow breaths visible in the icy air. The worst was over, but neither of them could shake the feeling that something was still terribly, terribly wrong. Eric's hands still trembled as he wiped the dried blood from his fingers. The things they had cut out of the reindeer's flesh lay buried beneath the snow inside the cave, but he could still feel them writhing beneath his skin, as if they had crawled into his own mind, whispering their secrets. He cast a glance toward the distant tundra. The snow had stopped falling, revealing a landscape that stretched infinitely in every direction. A void, empty yet teeming with unseen dangers. Somewhere out there, the rest of the herd had moved on. Had they been infected too? Were they carrying the same slow rot in their bodies, waiting to be discovered too late? He swallowed hard. They had no way of knowing. Ayla shivered beside him, her face pale, her breath coming in short, uneven puffs. "We need to get it back to base," she murmured, voice barely above a whisper. Eric nodded, but something gnawed at his gut. If this was a disease, something new, something unnatural, was bringing it back to base the right thing to do? Would they be carrying something more than an injured reindeer back with them? Would they be spreading it? For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence of the Arctic pressed down on them, vast and suffocating. Then, a sound. Faint, distant, but there, a howl. Eric's blood went cold. That wasn't a wolf. It came again, long and unnatural, reverberating through the frozen expanse. Something deep and wrong, the kind of sound that made his instincts scream at him to run. Ayla's hand shot to his arm, gripping it with ice-cold fingers. "Eric!" He followed her gaze. Far in the distance, barely visible through the shifting haze of ice and light, shadows moved. Dozens of them, standing still, watching, too large to be wolves, too silent to be normal. His stomach twisted. The herd, the missing reindeer. But they weren't moving like reindeer should. They stood perfectly still, lined along the distant ridge, their heads tilted at an unnatural angle, waiting, or watching. Eric felt his breath catch in his throat. Something inside them wasn't right. Something was in them. And then, one of them moved. It took a single slow step forward, and then another. The rest followed. The distant shapes began advancing toward them, not running, not charging, just walking. A slow, deliberate march through the snow. Eric grabbed Ayla's wrist. "We have to go! Now!" They didn't hesitate. The snowmobile roared to life, kicking up a storm of ice behind them as they sped away from the cave, away from the herd, away from the unknown terror that followed in the distance. The reindeer barely stirred on the sled, its breathing weak but steady. They had saved it. But as Eric cast one last look over his shoulder, his stomach twisted with dread. The herd had stopped again, their heads still turned in his direction, watching, waiting, like they knew something he didn't. As the horizon swallowed them, their outlines faded into the storm. But Eric knew they were still there, waiting for whatever came next.